The concert by Cappella Mariana and L'Achéron bring us a program of settings for Holy Week. That is the days commemorating the Passion of Jesus Christ between Palm Sunday and Easter. So the idea is to show how the musical talent that spread from Antwerp in the 16th century came to define the sound world of very important institutions across Europe. And for this reason, the program focuses on a very specific composer, Carolus Luython, a composer native of Antwerp, who spent his career around 1600 in Central Europe, between Vienna and Prague, at the service of the Habsburg emperors. And in this introductory lecture, I'd like to give you some information to contextualize the composer and his work, to understand the genres performed at the concert and their particular liturgical context, and also to understand the peculiar performance practice that will be explored during the concert, that is the blending of the sound of the voices of Cappella Mariana and the viols of L'Achéron. So Carolus Luython was a native of Antwerp, and as many of his fellow countrymen, he got a music education and he found employment in important institutions in Europe. And we know that in 1566, when he was just a little boy, he must have been around 8, he found employment as a choir boy in the chapel of Maximilian II, the emperor, who resided in Vienna. And at some point later in the stage, we know that he spent time in Italy to further his education in music, as it was common at the time. In the late 16th century, Italy had become the hotbed of musical innovation. And at some point in the 1570s, he returned to the north as an organist of the Imperial Chapel. And with the Imperial Chapel, he moved to Prague, because at the time Rudolf II became emperor, and he moved again the imperial court back to Prague. So at the end of the 16th century, the Central European city of Prague had become a sort of not only the political center of the empire, but also its cultural center, thanks to a system of patronage that was enabled by the presence of the imperial court. And so Luython stayed in the service of the emperor for all his life until 1612, when the emperor died, and his successor, the Emperor Matthias, decided to disband the court chapel, and basically firing all the musicians without paying the debts. And so Luython died in poverty in 1620. And it's also maybe worth adding that he is a little bit a forgotten composer, because most of his works were transmitted in Central European sources, mostly from Prague, so it has not it has not received the attention he deserves, and that's why also the concert you're going to hear has a particular importance, because it sheds light on a very important figure who has been unjustly forgotten. So the program of the concert focuses on a specific musical genre set to music by Luython called the Lamentations, which were supposed to be performed during a specific ritual, the ritual known as tenebre. And so what do these terms mean? So tenebre is Latin, it means darkness, and is a sort of nickname given to the liturgical services known as matins and lauds. That is, the services that took place during the night and at dawn in the last 3 days of Holy Week, the so-called Paschal Triduum. So it was a ritual that commemorated the passion and death of Christ. And as you can imagine, it was a very, very important and very elaborate liturgy, which was also defined by a very characteristic emotional climate. So it was a penitential ritual, it was a mournful ritual. So the name tenebre, darkness, of course, points at the mournful character of this liturgy, also points at the fact that it was supposed to be a night liturgy, because it was matins and lauds, so it took place after midnight. But also, the name points at a very particular ritual that took place in those 3 days of Holy Week, a ritual that probably dates already to the 5th century after Christ. So during the last 3 days of Holy Week, all the candles in the church were gradually put off, so that at the end of the Saturday of the Holy Week, the church would be in complete darkness. And hence the name tenebrae, which points at the darkness of the church. So in practice, in fact, we know that in the 16th century, tenebrae, this ritual, was not celebrated during the night, but it was celebrated during the afternoon of the day before. So the tenebrae of Thursday would take place in the late afternoon of Wednesday. And the reason behind this is probably very practical. It had become a very important ceremony, a very important ritual where people were supposed to go, not only monks and priests, and to ease the participation of the public, let's say, they would take place in the late afternoon instead of during the night. The celebration of the Triduum involved different musical genres. It involved psalms, it involved responsories, and a very important type of chant that was performed during the Tenebrae was the Lamentations. The Lamentations are fragments of text taken from the Bible, specifically from the book of Lamentations, that is in the Old Testament. And the book of Lamentations is a collection of poetic laments that commemorate the first destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 1586 before Christ. So these texts were read, but actually most commonly sung during Holy Week to commemorate, as I said, the Passion and death of Christ. So they created a sort of symbolic relation between the death of Christ and the destruction of the Temple. Traditionally, they would be performed with in plain chant, so in these monodic liturgical melodies, traditionally used in the liturgy, and they would be performed with a very simple plain chant formula, so a very simple repetitive tone that would just facilitate the performance of the text. And polyphony for the Lamentations starts being used quite late only in the 15th century, which is quite astonishing if we think that polyphony, that is complex music with more lines sounding together, was commonly used for Christmas, for instance, already around the 1200. And with the Lamentations, it starts only 200 years later. And the reasons for this is probably to be found in the mournful and penitential character of this liturgy. We see the same with the Requiem music, with the music with Mass for the Dead. Because polyphony in the late Middle Ages was often seen as something festive, something joyous to be used in festive liturgies like Christmas or Easter, in liturgies like Holy Week, which was mournful and penitential, at the beginning, they tended not to use it. In the 15th century, slowly, polyphony for the Lamentations, for the Holy Week, starts emerging. We find it more and more often in the sources. And around 1500, it becomes a common genre, which has also very specific stylistic features. It's very simple music. It tends to be very homorhythmic, so all the parts sing all together the same text, and there's usually a cantus firmus, that is, one of the part re-elaborates the original plain chant melody of the Lamentations. So this simplicity is not simplicity on its own sake, it's simplicity that it was supposed to match, to mirror the penitential character of the liturgy during which the Lamentations were performed. In the second half of the 16th century, so in the period in which Luython will compose his Lamentations, something happens. There is an increasing interest in music for penitential liturgies. We start seeing in print more and more Lamentations, and we start seeing in print also more and more music for the Requiem Mass, for instance, which is also a very similar liturgy. And also this music starts being influenced by the style of the motet. The motet is a genre of sacred music which is fairly elaborate from a compositional point of view, and we can see that at the time, around 1560s, the Lamentation starts being much more complex. They tend to be very long motets. So Luython's Lamentations were published in print in 1604 in Prague. And on the title page, Luython proudly declares of being the organist and composer of Emperor Rudolf II, so the emperor of whose court resided in Prague. So we understand it's a very representative publication. It's really something to represent the status of Luython as a composer of the emperor. And in his lamentation settings, as I said, Luython chooses a style which is very much influenced by the by the more florid, more elaborate style of the contemporary motet. So it's more, let's call it more complex than the Lamentations we find in the early 16th century. And in a way, we can interpret this as an attempt by Luython to find a compromise between the penitential tone of the liturgy of Holy Week, which is something very special, as I said, but also the necessity of representing through sound the splendor of the imperial court. Although, of course, this is fairly complex music, as you will hear, the structure and the content of the print of Luython's music matches the ritual and the liturgical form of the real ritual of Tenebrae, which took place during Holy Week. And for this reason, because this is, first of all, it's liturgical music. It's music that was supposed to be performed during the liturgy. For this reason, the collection contains also two settings of the Benedictus and the Miserere, which, strictly speaking, are not lamentations. The Benedictus is a canticle and the Miserere is a psalm, but they were usually performed to conclude the ritual of lauds, and for that reason they were necessary for a celebration of Tenebrae, and that's why Luython sets them to music and includes them in the print. And you will hear at the concert a performance of the Miserere, which concluded the ritual of Tenebrae, and it will conclude the concert as well. So not only the structure of the collection is defined by the liturgy, but also the form of the music itself is defined by how the Lamentations were performed in the liturgy. So each lamentation begins with a Hebrew letter. The Lamentations are in Latin, but the first word is a Hebrew letter, Aleph, Bet, and so on, suggesting that the Lamentations were originally a acrostic poetry, so building up an acrostic using letters from the alphabet. So these Hebrew letters were maintained in the Latin translation of the Lamentations. And what is interesting is that they started being treated by composer as a sort of a self-enclosed movement, usually using a very melismatic style. So these single letters, like Aleph, they are set to music with a very florid style of composition. Also, another interesting thing is that each lamentation concludes with a refrain. Always the same text concludes each lamentation, which in English it reads something like, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, return unto the Lord thy God. Some composers treat this refrain that concludes each lamentation as a musical refrain, so they use exactly the same music at the end of each lamentation in order to create a sort of cycle. Luython, interestingly, does not do this. He always comes up with a new idea. And in that you can see that he's influenced by the necessity of variatio, by this desire of doing always something slightly new. So you will hear during the concert that this textual refrain, you will recognize it's the same text coming back, but you will hear that Luython explores always new musical ideas in them. So in fact, while the older styles of the Lamentations in the first half of the 16th century were really being faithful to a fairly homorhythmic declamation of the text, with Luython's Lamentation we can really see that he's very much influenced by the motet style of composition. So his ideal is always having imitations, many musical ideas, guaranteeing the constant variation of the music. So one of the most fascinating features of the concert you will hear is the blending of the voices of Cappella Mariana with the viols of L'Achéron. What is important to state is that in the original source of Luython's Lamentations, we only have the parts for the voices. We don't have music for viols. But the idea to mix the two actually explores a possibility, a performance practice possibility that emerged through the study of historical performance practices of Lamentations. So it's important to remember that at the end of the 16th century, the use of instruments during the liturgy, generally speaking, was very common, including but not limited to the organ, especially for festive liturgies. Holy Week and the Tenebrae ritual, just like the liturgy for the dead, it had a penitential character, and because of this penitential character, it also was characterized by a special sound. We know, for instance, that during the Holy Week, the organ, that usually was used throughout the year, was supposed to be silent, just like it was common during Masses for the dead, because being a penitential liturgy, being a liturgy which had a very specific mournful emotional character, this emotional character was expressed also through a specific soundscape of the liturgy. So the organ, as an instrument that expressed joy, was supposed to stay silent. However, at the end of the 16th century, as I said, the use of instruments was increasingly common in churches, and so musicians developed a strategy to, in a way, safeguard the penitential character and the special character of the lamentation, and at the same time have instrumental contribution to the performance of the liturgy. And we know from archival research that from the late 16th century onwards, Italian churches started hiring viol players, especially to perform during Holy Week and especially for the Lamentations. So it's interesting because we can reconstruct a performance practice not from the sources, because it's not written in the musical scores, but we can reconstruct it from studying archival records, payments from churches. This performance practice at some point appears also in the written music. And one of the motets you will hear in the concert, Grandis Ovo Somnes, which is a text which is related to the Lamentations, is actually scored in the source with accompaniment of 3 viols. This is also very interesting because the first Lamentations with viols written in the source are from the 1610s, 1612s, around that. But we know from archival records that the practice of using viols during the performance of Lamentations is much older. And there are sources that attest it, which are at least 50 years older than that. So the use of viols during the Lamentations in Prague around 1600, when Luython was there, has not been researched yet. But what we can say is that Luython was in Italy, he got his music education in Italy, so he was certainly familiar with the practice of using viols for their special affective power to accompany the mournful text of the Lamentations. Moreover, we know of something else about the relation between this performance tradition and the imperial court. A much later example of this comes from the second half of the 17th century. When the imperial court is back in Vienna, during Holy Week, it was common to perform sepulchri. Sepulchri are a special type of sacred oratorio devoted, commemorating the Passion and the death of Christ. And we know that in the performance of sepulchri, it was very common to employ viols. And this is clearly like a late 17th century adaptation of a much older performance practice that had been born within the performance of polyphonic lamentations. And so what is interesting and what is fascinating of the experiment of the concert by Cappella Mariana L'Achéron is that we can see how the study of historical performance practice is not just to decide what is right, what is wrong. It's not about telling musicians what they should do, but it's about opening up possibilities that can be then explored in concerts and just see how they sound. And notwithstanding the mournful tone of the music that will be performed during the concert by Cappella Mariana L'Achéron, I hope you will enjoy the concert.